Charles X spent his life believing his body was sacred, chosen by God to rule France. But his end did not come with the dignity of a throne, nor the drama of a guillotine like his brother. It came in the form of the Blue Death. Cholera, the ruthless plague of the 19th century, didn't care about his crown. It drained him dry, turning a monarch into a shriveled blue husk in just 24 hours. The last Bourbon didn't die in glory. He died in biological humiliation. Nature never bows to kings. Before the rented palace in Gorizia became a house of horror, and before the Blue Death turned a king into a shriveled husk, Charles lived at the height of the pedestal. The depth of his fall begins at the summit. Charles was born in 1757 at the Palace of Versailles, the epicenter of the Western world's glamour and power. He was the Comte d'Artois, the youngest brother of the future King Louis XVI. If you could take the concept of privilege and distill it into a single human being, it was the young Artois. He was handsome, dashing, and spectacularly vacuous. While his brother Louis was serious, indecisive, and socially awkward, Artois was the life of the party. He was the golden boy of the Ancien Regime. He spent his 20s in a haze of perfume, gambling, and high-stakes affairs. He accrued debts that were so astronomical they became a matter of state concern, yet he waved them away with a manicured hand. Why worry about money when you own the state? Why worry about public opinion when you are appointed by heaven? He was the leader of the ultra-royalist faction, the hardliners, who believed that the monarchy should be absolute, that the aristocracy was a separate species from the common man, and that any concession to democracy was a sin against God. When the French Revolution exploded in 1789, Artois didn't try to understand it. He didn't try to negotiate. He fled. He was one of the first to emigrate, leaving his brother and sister-in-law, Marie Antoinette, to face the guillotine. For 25 years, he wandered Europe, an angry, embittered exile, constantly plotting to invade his own country, constantly lobbying foreign courts to crush the French Republic. He learned absolutely nothing from the revolution. In fact, his exile only hardened him. He became convinced that his brother had died because he was too soft, too willing to compromise. Artois promised himself that if he ever regained the throne, he would not make the same mistake. He would rule with an iron fist wrapped in velvet, and incredibly, against all odds, history gave him that chance. Napoleon was defeated. The Bourbons were restored. And in 1824, the old roué, the former playboy of Versailles, became King Charles X. The biological desecration of 1836 stands in gruesome contrast to his coronation in 1825. Charles decided to revive the full medieval ceremony of consecration at the Cathedral of Reims, a ritual that hadn't been performed in half a century. It was a deliberate piece of political theater designed to tell the world that the Revolution was dead and that the Middle Ages were back. The great Gothic cathedral was draped in crimson velvet and gold. The air was thick with incense. Charles, dressed in satin, lay face down on the floor in an act of prostration before the altar. The Archbishop of Reims approached him with the holy ampulla, a vial of sacred oil that, according to legend, had been brought down from heaven by a dove to baptize Clovis the Frank in the 5th century. The Archbishop took a pinhead of this oil, which was actually a fragment recovered after revolutionaries had smashed the original vial, and mixed it with chrism. He anointed Charles on the crown of his head, on his chest, between his shoulders, on his right shoulder, on his left shoulder, in the bend of his right arm, and in the bend of his left arm. This wasn't just a ceremony. In the eyes of the church and Charles himself, This was a chemical change. The oil was believed to permeate his being, transforming him from a man into a persona mixta, part priest, part king. It gave him the miraculous power to heal the sick. 2 days after the coronation, Charles walked through the hospitals of Paris, touching scrofula patients, people suffering from tuberculosis of the neck lymph nodes, saying the ritual phrase, "The king touches you, God heals you." He believed his body was holy. He believed his flesh was different from the flesh of the carpenter or the baker. He believed he was immune to the chaotic, dirty realities of ordinary life. But nature is patient, and nature is cruel. For 6 years, Charles tried to turn back the clock. He censored the press. He compensated aristocrats who had lost land. He handed the education system over to the church. He alienated the middle class, the workers, and eventually even the moderate royalists. He was a man trying to stop a hurricane by closing a window. In July 1830, he went too far. He issued the 4 ordinances, effectively dissolving the Parliament and stripping away the last vestiges of political liberty. Paris did not hesitate. The city erupted. In 3 blistering hot days known as Les Trois Glorieuses, the people of Paris built barricades, fought the royal troops, and forced the king to abdicate. It was a humiliating collapse. Charles had believed God would send thunderbolts to protect him. Instead, he found himself sitting in a carriage once again, rumbling toward the coast, heading into his second final exile. He was 73 years old. He had lost his crown, his palaces, and his purpose, but he still had his pride. Even in defeat, he insisted on maintaining the rigid etiquette of the court. His entourage was forced to stop for elaborate meals on the roadside, pretending they were still at the Tuileries, while the world they knew crumbled behind them. The years between 1830 and 1836 were a slow gray drift toward the grave. The fallen king and his family, his son, the Duke of Angoulême, his daughter-in-law, the Duchess of Berry, and his grandchildren became high society vagrants. They stayed first in England at Lulworth Castle, and then at the gloomy, wind-swept Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh. Holyrood was a nightmare for Charles. It was damp, cold, and steeped in the tragic history of Mary, Queen of Scots. But worse than the ghosts were the finances. Charles had left massive debts in France, and his creditors were chasing him across borders. In Scotland, he was legally protected from arrest only within the precincts of the palace. If he stepped foot outside the royal grounds on a Sunday, he could be thrown into debtor's prison. The King of France was a prisoner in his own home, pacing the drafty galleries, looking out at the rain-soaked Scottish hills, a sacred monarch hiding from bill collectors. From Scotland, they moved to Prague, settling in the Hradčany Castle. It was a grander setting, but the atmosphere was funereal. The court was a bubble of silence and prayer. Charles spent his days hunting, his one remaining pleasure, and his evenings playing whist. He became obsessed with his own salvation, perhaps sensing that the end was approaching. He attended Mass daily, sometimes twice a day. He became a ghost haunting Europe, a relic of a time that everyone else was trying to forget. But by 1836, even Prague was becoming difficult. The Emperor of Austria was kind, but the political climate was shifting, and Charles's health, though remarkably robust for a man nearing 80, was beginning to fray at the edges. He complained of the cold. He wanted the sun. He wanted to be near the sea. And so, the decision was made to move south to Gorizia. It seemed like the perfect solution. Gorizia was known as the Austrian Nice. It had a mild climate, beautiful scenery, and was quiet enough for a deposed king to live out his days in obscurity. However, as the royal carriage convoy wound its way south through the Austrian Alps in October 1836, they were driving straight into the path of a monster. While Charles had been playing whist and praying in Prague, something else had been traveling across the globe. It had started years earlier, in the brackish, warm waters of the Ganges Delta in India. For centuries, it had lived there quietly, a local curse. But the British Empire, with its ships and troop movements, had inadvertently given it a ticket to ride. It was Vibrio cholerae. In a modern world of antibiotics, the 19th century cholera pandemic seemed distant. But in 1830s, Europe, cholera was an apocalypse. It was terrifying, not just because it killed, but because of how it killed. It was sudden. You could wake up healthy, have breakfast with your family, and be dead by sunset. It was indiscriminate. It killed the poor in the slums and the rich in their mansions, and it was disgusting. There is no polite way to say it. Cholera turned the human body into a leaking vessel. It stripped away all dignity, reducing a person to a writhing, vomiting mess of fluids. The doctors of the time called it the Asiatic cholera. They tracked its progress in the newspapers like they tracked the movement of an invading army. It moved from India to Russia. It devastated Moscow. It marched into Poland. It reached Berlin, Paris, London. In Paris, during the outbreak of 1832, just 2 years after Charles had fled, the disease had killed nearly 20,000 people in 6 months. It was a time of hysteria. People accused the government of poisoning the wells. They rioted in the streets. The rich fled to their country estates only to find the disease waiting for them in the water of their own wells. The medical establishment was helpless. They didn't know it was a bacterium. They didn't know it was waterborne. They thought it was caused by miasma, clouds of bad air that rose from rotting vegetation and filth. They advised people to wear flannel belts to keep their stomachs warm. They burned tar in the streets to purify the air. They bled patients who were already dying of dehydration, hastening their end. When Charles X decided to move to Gorizia, he was warned. There were reports of cholera in the Veneto region, in Trieste, and in the villages surrounding Gorizia. The disease was flaring up again, part of the second cholera pandemic that was sweeping the continent. But Charles was stubborn. He was a Bourbon. He had survived the Revolution, the guillotine, the Napoleonic Wars, and the uprising of 1830. He had a profound fatalistic belief that God would decide his time, not a germ. He dismissed the warnings. He was tired of the cold in Prague. He wanted to go south. The journey was grueling. The roads were bad, and the inns were frightened of travelers, afraid they would bring the sickness with them. When the royal party finally arrived in Gorizia in late October, they found a town on edge. The locals were nervous. There were rumors of cases in the nearby countryside, peasants dying in their huts, bodies being buried quickly in lime pits. Charles moved into the Palazzo Coronini Kronberg. It was a handsome building, sitting on a slight rise with a view of the town. It wasn't Versailles. It wasn't the Tuileries. It wasn't even Holyrood. It was a comfortable bourgeois mansion, the kind of place a wealthy merchant might own. For a man who had been anointed with the oil of Clovis, it was a humble final stage. The first few days in Gorizia were deceptive. The sun shone. The air was crisp and clean, seemingly free of the miasma everyone feared. Charles felt his spirits lift. He unpacked his hunting guns. He organized his small household. He began to plan his winter, imagining long walks in the gardens and quiet evenings by the fire. He didn't know that the clock had already started ticking. He didn't know that the water he was drinking, or perhaps the food he was eating, or the hand he had shaken, had already introduced the enemy into his fortress. The Vibrio cholerae bacteria is a curved, rod-shaped organism with a long tail called a flagellum that allows it to swim. It is a masterpiece of evolutionary design. Once it enters the human mouth, it must survive the acid bath of the stomach. Most bacteria die there, but if enough are ingested, or if the person's stomach acid is low, common in the elderly, some survive. They pass into the small intestine, and there they find their paradise. The warm, nutrient-rich environment of the human gut is exactly where they want to be. They use their tails to swim through the thick mucus lining of the intestine and attach themselves to the intestinal wall. And then they begin to multiply. In the silence of the Palazzo Coronini, inside the body of the King of France, a microscopic invasion force was assembling. They were millions, then billions. They began to produce a toxin, a protein that acts as a chemical key. This key unlocks the cells of the intestinal wall, tricking them into opening their floodgates. Normally, your intestine absorbs water. It takes the liquid from your food and drink and moves it into your bloodstream to keep you hydrated. The cholera toxin reverses this flow. It forces the cells to dump water and electrolytes out of the blood and into the gut. It is a biological catastrophe. It is a physiological dam break. On November 3rd, 1836, Charles celebrated his name day, the feast of St. Charles Borromeo. He felt well, he attended Mass, he ate a hearty dinner, he joked with his courtiers. He was the picture of an old man at peace. But the bacteria were ready. The toxin was beginning to do its work. The floodgates were about to open. The king went to bed that night, perhaps feeling a slight rumble in his stomach, a vague sense of unease. He pulled the heavy blankets up to his chin, closing his eyes on a world that still respected him as a monarch. When he would wake, that world would be gone. There would be no more etiquette, no more protocol, no more Your Majesty. There would only be pain, filth, and the terrifying bluing silence of the end. The king was about to experience the reality of being nothing more than a biological machine breaking down. The Blue Death had arrived at the Palazzo Coronini, and it had come for the last Bourbon. The sun rose over Gorizia on Friday, November 4th, 1836, casting a pale, indifferent light over the red-tiled roofs and the cypress trees that lined the hills. Inside the Palazzo Coronini, the air was still thick with the silence of sleep. The household of the exiled King of France was stirring slowly, anticipating another day of quiet exile, perhaps a mass in the private chapel, a game of whist, a stroll in the autumn gardens. But in the king's bedchamber, the silence had already been broken, and Charles X awoke not with the gradual, foggy ascent from sleep that usually accompanies old age, but with a sudden, violent jolt of internal alarm. It was a sensation of absolute wrongness in the gut, a churning, roiling pressure that felt less like indigestion and more like a foreign entity moving within him. He was a man who had enjoyed remarkably robust health for his 79 years. He was accustomed to the stiffness of joints or the occasional fatigue of a long hunt. But this was different. This was urgent. He tried to sit up. The room spun. A wave of nausea, cold and profound, washed over him, starting from the pit of his stomach and radiating out to his fingertips, which were trembling. He called out for his valet. His voice, usually booming and authoritative, sounded thin, as if the air in his lungs had suddenly evaporated. Before the valet could even properly assist him, the catastrophe began. The king's body, which had been disciplined by decades of rigid court etiquette, a body that had been taught to sit motionless for hours on a throne, to walk with a measured, gliding step, to control every sneeze and every cough, suddenly revolted. The first evacuation was explosive. It was not the ordinary distress of a stomach upset. It was a deluge. What poured out of Charles X was the first horrifying signature of the Asiatic cholera. Physicians of the time called it rice water stool. It is a deceptively gentle name for a substance that signals the body's total collapse. The liquid was not brown or bile-stained. It was a pale, turbid, grayish-white fluid flecked with mucus, resembling water in which rice has been boiled. It had a peculiar, sickly sweet, musky odor, the smell of raw meat or semen, that would soon permeate the heavy velvet curtains and the polished wood of the bedchamber, a scent that no amount of potpourri or incense could mask. Dr. Bourbon, the king's first surgeon, was summoned immediately. Bourbon was a man of the old school, a veteran of the royal household, who had followed his master into exile. He had treated the king for gout, for colds, for the aches of age. But as he hurried into the room, clutching his medical bag, the smell hit him first. He stopped for a fraction of a second in the doorway. He knew that smell. Every doctor in Europe knew it by reputation, even if they hadn't smelled it in person. It was the scent of the grave. Bourbon approached the bedside. The king was pale, beads of cold sweat standing out on his forehead. "I am cold, Bourbon," the king whispered. "I am so cold." The doctor felt the king's pulse. It was thready, fast, but weak, fluttering like a trapped bird against the rib cage. This was the first sign of hypovolemic shock. Charles was losing fluids so fast that his blood volume was dropping by the minute. His heart was pumping frantically, trying to circulate a diminishing supply of blood to keep his vital organs alive. Bourbon tried to maintain a facade of professional calm, but internally he must have been seized by terror. In 1836, a diagnosis of cholera in a 79-year-old man was not a diagnosis. It was a death sentence. There was no saline drip to hang, no antibiotics to administer. The medical arsenal of the 19th century was pitifully unmatched against the ferocity of Vibrio cholerae. The doctor ordered the standard futile countermeasures. He called for hot bricks to be wrapped in flannel and placed at the king's icy feet. He ordered mustard poultices, paste made of ground mustard seeds, to be applied to the king's stomach and legs, hoping the irritation would draw the blood to the surface and generate heat. He ordered a tea of lime blossoms and mint, hoping to settle the stomach. It was like trying to put out a forest fire with a thimble of water. Down in the microscopic landscape of the king's small intestine, the war was already lost. The bacteria had colonized the gut lining. They were pumping out the cholera toxin with ruthless efficiency. The toxin had bound to the GM1 ganglioside receptors on the surface of the king's intestinal cells. It had infiltrated the cells and flipped a biological switch, permanently activating an enzyme called adenylate cyclase. This caused the levels of cyclic AMP to skyrocket, which in turn locked the chloride channels open. Chloride ions were flooding out of the cells and into the gut. Sodium followed to balance the charge. Water followed to balance the osmosis. The king's own blood plasma was being sucked across the intestinal wall and flushed out of his body. He was literally liquefying from the inside out. By mid-morning, the vomiting began. This was the second hammer blow. The king could keep nothing down. The mint tea, the broth, even sips of water were violently ejected moments after being swallowed. The vomiting was effortless and projectile, a simple spasmodic heave of the diaphragm that expelled gallons of fluid. The scene in the bedchamber descended into a nightmare of indignity. Charles X, the man who had been the most fastidious dresser in Europe, who had owned hundreds of pairs of shoes, and whose cravats were starched to perfection, was now lying in a bed soiled by his own uncontrollable waste. The servants, eyes wide with fear behind their masks of duty, hurried in and out with basins and fresh linens. They could barely keep up. The king would be cleaned, fresh sheets laid down, and within minutes, the spasms would return, and the linen would be soaked again with the rice water flood. This is the specific horror of cholera that history books often gloss over. It strips the victim of their humanity before it takes their life. It forces the sufferer to become an object of disgust to themselves. Charles was fully conscious. He was not delirious with fever. Cholera is a cold disease. The body temperature actually drops. He was awake, alert, and acutely aware of the mess he was making. He apologized to his valet. He apologized to the doctor. He tried, with the ingrained reflex of a gentleman, to turn away when he vomited, but he was too weak. As the afternoon wore on, the Blue Death began to paint its masterpiece on the king's body. The loss of fluid was now critical. He had likely lost 4 or 5 liters of water in just a few hours. His blood was turning into sludge. It was becoming thick, viscous, like tar. The red blood cells were clumping together, unable to squeeze through the tiny capillaries to deliver oxygen to the skin and extremities. Dr. Bourbon watched in horror as the king's appearance transformed before his eyes. It was a metamorphosis that usually takes weeks of starvation or years of aging, compressed into a single afternoon. The king's nose became pointed and sharp, the flesh receding against the cartilage. This is the classic facies cholerica. The cheeks collapsed inward. The lips, once full and commanding, became thin, drawn bands of purple. But it was the eyes that were the most haunting. The fat pads behind the eyeballs, which are made mostly of water, dehydrated and shrank. The king's eyes sank deep into his skull, retreating into dark, bruised-looking hollows. He looked out at his weeping family from the bottom of 2 deep wells. The eyelids turned a dark, bruised violet, and then the color changed. First, it was the fingernails. They turned a dark slate blue, then the tips of the fingers, then the hands. The cyanosis crept up his limbs. His feet turned the color of lead. The skin lost its elasticity entirely. When Dr. Bourbon pinched the skin on the king's hand to check for turgor, the skin didn't snap back. It stayed pinched, standing up in a ridge like molded clay or wet dough. The medical texts of the time called this washerwoman's hands, wrinkled, sodden, and gray. Charles looked at his own hands. He saw the blue tint spreading. He knew what it meant. He had heard the stories of the Paris epidemic. He knew that when you turned blue, the end was near. Then came the cramps. If the vomiting and diarrhea were humiliating, the cramps were pure torture. As the electrolytes, sodium, potassium, calcium, were washed out of his body, the electrical signals in his muscles went haywire. The king suddenly cried out, a sound that was less of a scream and more of a dry, rasping gasp. His legs jerked violently. The muscles of his calves knotted into hard, rock-like lumps beneath the skin. His toes curled inward, locking in a painful spasm. The cramps moved to his abdomen, the muscles tearing at themselves. "My legs, oh God, my legs," he rasped. The pain was excruciating. It felt as if his muscles were being torn from the bone. The Duke of Angoulême, his son, and the Duchess of Berry, his daughter-in-law, rushed to the bedside. They grabbed his legs, trying to massage the knots out of the muscles, trying to straighten his twisted limbs. The king writhed in their grip, sweat pouring off him, a cold, clammy sweat that felt like slime. It was a tableau of utter despair. The heir to the throne of France, the man who would have been Louis XIX, was on his knees rubbing the blue, withered calves of his dying father, while the smell of sickness filled the room. Dr. Bourbon stood by the window, mixing a solution of laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol. It was the only mercy he could offer. He administered a few drops on a spoon, hoping to dull the pain of the cramps and perhaps slow the peristalsis of the gut. The king swallowed it, but minutes later he retched again, bringing it back up. The opium had no time to work. Outside the palazzo, the sun began to set behind the Julian Alps. The sky turned a bruised purple, mirroring the color of the king's lips. The news had begun to spread through the household and into the town. The king is sick. The king has the cholera. The fear in the palazzo was palpable. The servants whispered in the corridors, holding handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar over their noses and mouths. They knew that cholera was contagious, though they didn't know how. They looked at the soiled linens being carried out to be burned and saw their own deaths. But to their credit, and perhaps due to the intense loyalty the old Bourbon inspired in his inner circle, no one fled. They stayed. They boiled water. They changed the sheets. They prayed. Inside the room, the king's voice had changed. The dehydration had dried out his vocal cords and the mucous membranes of his throat. When he spoke now, it was in a high-pitched, husky whisper, almost a squeak. Physicians call this the vox cholerica. "I am dying," he whispered to his son. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. The Duke of Angoulême, a man who had never possessed his father's charisma but loved him deeply, tried to reassure him. "No, sire, it is a passing flux. You are strong. You will recover." Charles shook his head slowly. The movement was barely perceptible. "I know this enemy," he whispered. "It does not bargain." As night fell, the room was lit by candles. The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the king's sunken face look even more skeletal. He looked like a living skull resting on the pillow. The blue pallor had spread to his entire face now. He looked like a man who had been strangled, or a man who had been drowned in freezing water. He was thirsty, a thirst so profound it felt like burning sand in his throat. "Water," he begged. "Ice." They gave him chipped ice. He sucked on it greedily, his blue lips trembling. But the relief was momentary. The water would go down, and the monster in his gut would throw it back up or pass it through. He was a vessel with a hole in the bottom. Dr. Bourbon monitored the pulse. It was barely there. The blood pressure was plummeting. The kidneys had stopped working hours ago, a condition called anuria. The king was no longer producing urine because there was simply no water left in his blood to filter. The toxins that the kidneys usually flushed out were now building up in his system, beginning to poison his brain. Yet cruelly his mind remained clear. The uremic coma hadn't set in yet. He was trapped in the wreckage of his body, fully witnessing its destruction. He looked at the crucifix hanging on the wall opposite his bed. He had spent his life defending the church, believing that his crown was a gift from Christ. Now, in his final agony, he sought the comfort of that faith. He asked for the confessor. He wanted to make his peace. He wanted to confess the sins of a long life, the mistresses of his youth, the pride of his reign, the anger of his exile. He wanted to be shriven before the blue darkness swallowed him completely. The bishop of Hermopolis, who was part of the retinue, entered the room. He wore his stole, his face grave and pale. He approached the bed where the most Christian king lay in his filth. The smell was overpowering, but the bishop did not flinch. He leaned close to the blue lips to hear the whispered confession of the dying monarch. In the candlelight, the contrast was stark. The golden vestments of the bishop, the symbol of eternal authority, against the gray, wasting flesh of the king. It was a scene that could have been painted by Goya, a dark, brutal depiction of the boundary between power and dust. The night of November 4th deepened. The king's breathing became shallow and rapid, Kussmaul breathing. His body was starving for oxygen, and his blood was becoming dangerously acidic due to the loss of bicarbonate. He was panting like a dog that has run too far. Every breath was a struggle. His chest heaved. The cramps returned again and again, twisting his body into impossible shapes. He moaned, a sound of pure animal misery. The Blue Death had done its work. It had taken a king and turned him into a biological curiosity, a textbook case of pathology. But the end was not yet here. The heart of the bourbon was stubborn. It continued to beat, pushing the sludge through the veins, fighting a war it had already lost. The long night of Gorizia had only just begun. Saturday, November 5th, 1836, broke over the Palazzo Coronini with a cruel, indifferent brightness. In the streets of Gorizia, the townspeople were beginning their daily routines, opening shutters, sweeping stoops, lighting fires against the autumn chill. But inside the second-floor bedchamber of the exiled king, the atmosphere was hermetically sealed, a suffocating bubble of impending death where time seemed to have warped. To the physicians and family members keeping vigil, the man in the bed no longer looked like Charles X. In the span of 24 hours, the Blue Death had performed a gruesome act of sculpture. It had chiseled away the flesh, the familiarity, and the grandeur, leaving behind something sharp, ancient, and terrifyingly raw. This phase of cholera is known as the algid stage, from the Latin algidus, meaning cold, and that was the defining reality of Saturday morning. The king was turning into ice. Dr. Bourbon, exhausted and ragged, moved around the bed with the mechanical desperation of a soldier fighting a battle that had ended hours ago. He touched the king's wrist. It was clammy, wet with the peculiar sticky sweat that characterizes the disease. Yet the skin itself was frigid. It felt like touching a river stone, pulled from freezing water. The king's body temperature had plummeted, likely hovering around 34 or 35 degrees Celsius. The internal fires of metabolism were being doused by the sheer volume of fluid loss. The medical team faced a horrific paradox. The standard medical doctrine of the 1830s often called for bloodletting to balance the humors or reduce inflammation. But Bourbon knew that to bleed Charles now would be murder. There was no blood to give. The king's blood had thickened into a substance resembling currant jelly or tar. If a vein were open, nothing would flow. The circulation had stagnated, the heart pushing sludge through narrowing vessels. Instead, they turned to friction. In a futile attempt to restore warmth and circulation, the valets and family members took turns rubbing the king's limbs. They used warm flannel cloths soaked in camphor and aromatic spirits, scrubbing the gray, shriveled skin of his arms and legs. They rubbed until their own arms ached, trying to generate heat through friction, trying to force the blood to move. "Harder," the king whispered. His voice was now barely a sound, a high, reedy rasp produced by vocal cords that were as dry as parchment. "I cannot feel my feet." This was the torture of the algid stage. While the skin was cold to the touch, the patient often felt an internal burning, a paradoxical sensation of heat in the core, while the extremities went numb. Charles kicked at the heavy blankets, trying to throw them off, gasping for air, only for the shivers to rack his body moments later, forcing the attendants to pile the covers back on. The most harrowing transformation, however, was in the face. The facies Hippocratica, the mask of death described by Hippocrates 2,000 years earlier, was now fully etched onto the king. The dehydration had consumed the retrobulbar fat pads behind his eyes. As a result, his eyes had not just sunken, they seemed to have retreated into the depths of his skull, the eyelids unable to fully close over them. This condition, known as lagophthalmos, meant that Charles lay with his eyes half open, staring fixedly at the ceiling, the whites of his eyes turning a dull, dry yellow, the pupils constricted to pinpoints. His nose had sharpened to a beak. The skin over his cheekbones was pulled so tight it looked translucent, revealing the bone structure beneath. The lips were now a dark, almost blackish purple, the color of a bruised plum. This was the cyanosis, reaching its peak. The oxygen deprivation was absolute. The hemoglobin in his blood, unable to release oxygen to the tissues, had turned dark blue. He was a blue king, lying in a pool of white linen. Watching this disintegration was a figure of immense historical tragedy. Marie-Thérèse, the Duchess of Angoulême. She sat by the bedside, her face a mask of stone. If Charles X was the symbol of the monarchy's pride, Marie-Thérèse was the symbol of its suffering. She was the daughter of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. She was the only member of the immediate royal family to survive the French Revolution. As a teenage girl, she had been imprisoned in the Temple Tower. She had heard the guards dragging her father to the guillotine. She had heard them take her mother. She had waited in the dark, alone, for years. Now, 40 years later, she was watching the last of her dynasty die. She held the king's cold blue hand in hers. She did not weep. She had shed all her tears in 1793. She simply wiped the cold sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief, leaning in close to catch his whispered requests. "The thirst," Charles gasped, "the fire in my throat." The thirst of cholera is legendary. It is a primal biological scream. The body, having lost 10, 15, perhaps 18 liters of water, is signaling a catastrophic drought. The mucous membranes of the mouth and throat become completely desiccated. The tongue swells and feels like a piece of rough leather in the mouth. Marie-Thérèse dipped a spoon into a glass of sugar water flavored with orange blossom. She trickled a few drops between the king's purple lips. He swallowed greedily, his throat convulsing. "More," he rasped, "more." She gave him another spoonful, and then the inevitable tragedy played out again. The stomach, irritated and spasming, rejected the water. The king heaved, his frail chest contracting violently, and the water was expelled. He fell back against the pillows, gasping, a tear of pure physical frustration leaking from his sunken eye. It was a torture worthy of Tantalus, the desperate need for water and the inability to keep it. By midday Saturday, the cramps returned with renewed ferocity. These were not the localized cramps of the previous night. These were systemic. The electrolyte imbalance, specifically the loss of potassium and calcium, caused the muscles to fire uncontrollably. The king's abdominal muscles knotted into hard ridges, visible beneath his nightshirt. His fingers curled into claws, the obstetrician's hand spasm, locking rigid. The pain was so intense that it broke through the lethargy of the shock. Charles, a man who had been raised to never show emotion, who had maintained a regal composure through riots and abdications, let out a low, guttural moan that chilled everyone in the room. "Why?" he whispered, looking at the crucifix on the wall. "Why is it so long?" It was a question that struck at the heart of the divine monarchy. Why would God allow his anointed lieutenant to suffer like an animal? Why was there no dignity in this end? This was not the noble death of a warrior king on the battlefield, nor the solemn, peaceful passing of a patriarch in his sleep. This was a death of squalor. The king was dissolving in his own excrement. The smell in the room was now heavy, hanging in the curtains and the tapestries. It was the smell of the vox cholerica, the smell of the rice water, the smell of stagnant blood. The windows were kept closed to prevent drafts, sealing the horror inside. In the early afternoon, a decision was made. The king needed the sacraments. The medical battle was lost. The spiritual battle was all that remained. The scene that followed was a surreal juxtaposition of the sacred and the profane. The table by the bed was cleared of basins and soiled rags. A white cloth was laid down. Candles were lit. The Cardinal de Latil, the king's grand almoner, entered wearing his vestments. Charles X, summoning the last reserves of his strength, tried to smooth his hair. He tried to adjust his nightshirt. Even now, facing the void, the instinct of the courtier remained. He had to look presentable for God. The cardinal approached with the oil for the extreme unction, the last rites. 11 years earlier at Rheims, Charles had been anointed with the oil of Clovis to make him a king. Now, he was being anointed with the oil of the sick to prepare him for the grave. The cardinal dabbed the holy oil on the king's eyelids, his ears, his nostrils, his lips, his hands, and his feet. By this holy anointing may the Lord pardon thee whatever sins thou hast committed. As the Latin prayers filled the room, replacing the sound of the king's labored breathing, a strange calm descended. Charles seemed to relax. The cramps appeared to subside momentarily, perhaps due to the exhaustion of the neuromuscular junctions, or perhaps due to the placebo effect of the ritual. He closed his eyes. "I have been a great sinner," he whispered to the cardinal. It was an admission that covered decades. The arrogance of his youth, the stubbornness of his rule, the blood spilled in the streets of Paris in 1830. "God is mercy, sire," the cardinal replied. But the biology of cholera has no theology. As soon as the rites were concluded, the physical reality crashed back in. The diarrhea returned, an involuntary release that shamed the king deeply. He turned his head away from Marie-Thérèse, unable to meet her eyes. The humiliation was total. The most Christian king was helpless, dependent on others to clean him like an infant. Outside the palazzo, the sun began to dip lower. Rumors were flying through Gorizia. Some said the king was already dead. Some said he had been poisoned by French agents of Louis Philippe. The local authorities were in a panic, preparing for the diplomatic and logistical nightmare of a royal funeral in a plague-ridden town. Inside, the king entered the stage of collapse. This is the terminal phase of cholera. The pulse becomes imperceptible at the wrist. The heart sounds, if listened to with a stethoscope, are faint and distant, like a ticking watch buried under a pillow. The skin becomes completely inelastic. The breath is cold. Charles began to drift. His mind, which had been so sharp and tormented, finally began to uncouple from reality. The uremia, the buildup of toxins in the blood due to kidney failure, was acting as a natural anesthetic. He started to mutter. He spoke of the Tuileries Palace. He spoke of the hunt. He called out names of people long dead, his brother Louis XVI, his mistress Madame de Polastron. He was hallucinating, his brain misfiring, as the chemical composition of his blood went haywire. "The stag," he murmured, his eyes fixed on a corner of the ceiling. "The stag is down. Call off the dogs." Dr. Bougon checked the king's feet. They were purple and cold as ice. The circulation had effectively ceased in the lower extremities. The body was shutting down, district by district. The lights were going out in the mansion, and yet the heart kept beating. It was a cruel vitality. Charles X came from a line of men who were physically resilient. His grandfather, Louis XV, had taken weeks to die of smallpox. The Bourbon Constitution was fighting the Vibrio toxin with a stubbornness that was agonizing to watch. As evening approached on Saturday, the king's breathing changed again. It became Cheney-Stokes respiration, a cyclical pattern of breathing that starts shallow, gets deeper and faster, then trails off into apnea for several seconds before starting the cycle again. Gasp, gasp, deep breath, Deep breath. Silence. 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 Gasp. Every time the silence stretched out, the family members held their breath, thinking it was the end. And then, with a terrible racking sound, the king would inhale again, dragging himself back for another minute of suffering. The room grew darker. The candles burned low. The shadows of the bedposts stretched across the wall like the bars of a prison cell. Marie-Thérèse rose stiffly from her chair. She had been sitting for hours. She walked to the window and looked out at the night sky over Gorizia. There were no stars. A heavy mist had rolled in from the Isonzo River. She thought of the irony. Charles had come here for the sun. He had come here to escape the gloom of Prague. And instead, he had found the darkest, coldest place on earth. He had found the Blue Death. She turned back to the bed. The king was quiet now. The vomiting had stopped simply because there was nothing left to vomit. The cramps had ceased because the muscles no longer had the energy to contract. He lay motionless, a wax figure melting in the heat of the disease, but his eyes were still open. They were dull, glazed, staring into the middle distance. They looked like the eyes of a fish on a market stall. Dr. Bourbon leaned in. "Sire?" There was no answer, but the chest still rose. The struggle was not over. The night of November 5th would be the longest night of all. The king was about to enter the final passage, the transition from the biological chaos of cholera to the final, absolute silence of history. The clocks in the Palazzo Coronini struck midnight, ushering in Sunday, November 6th, 1836. The sound was a hollow metallic intrusion into the stifling quiet of the death chamber. Outside, the town of Gorizia was asleep, its shutters barred tight against the night air and the invisible pestilence. Inside, the world had shrunk to the dimensions of a four-poster bed and the dying man who lay within it. The king now entered the final terminal phase of the Blue Death. For the watchers by the bedside, the Duke of Angoulême, Marie-Thérèse, and the faithful Dr. Bourbon, time had lost its meaning. They were trapped in the suspended animation of the death vigil. The candles had burned down to stubborn nubs of wax, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to perform a grotesque dance on the walls. The air in the room was heavy, almost solid, thick with the smell of laudanum, vinegar, and the unmistakably sweet, metallic scent of advanced organ failure. Charles X was no longer speaking. He was no longer moving. The violent thrashing and the agonizing cramps of the previous day had finally ceased, not because the disease had abated, but because the body had simply run out of energy. The adenosine triphosphate, the chemical fuel for muscle contraction, was exhausted. The king was limp, a marionette whose strings had been cut one by one. But he was not yet dead. In these early hours of Sunday morning, the king displayed the devastation of Vibrio cholerae in its absolute totality. The Blue Death was no longer just a tint on the fingernails. It had become the defining characteristic of his existence. The cyanosis was profound. The blood, now thick as molasses and stripped of its oxygen, had stagnated in the capillaries of the skin. His face was a mask of leaden gray blue. His hands, resting on the white counterpane, looked like the hands of a statue cast in bronze and left out in the rain to oxidize. They were cold, not cool, but truly cold, radiating a chill that could be felt inches away. This is the hallmark of the algid stage, the living body assuming the temperature of a corpse before the heart has even stopped. Dr. Bourbon, his eyes red-rimmed with fatigue, leaned over to check the pulse again. It was a futile gesture, a ritual of medicine performed when medicine has nothing left to offer. He pressed his fingers to the king's radial artery. Nothing. He moved to the carotid artery in the neck. There he felt it, a faint rapid flutter. Thump, 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 thump. It was terrifyingly fast. Perhaps 140 or 150 beats per minute, but incredibly weak. This was the vermicular pulse, named because it feels like a worm wriggling under the finger. The heart was vibrating rather than pumping. It was beating on empty chambers. The blood volume had dropped so low, perhaps by 50 or 60%, that the ventricles had nothing to squeeze. The pump was running dry, overheating, tearing itself apart in a desperate attempt to maintain blood pressure. Inside the king's brain, the lights were flickering out. The kidneys had failed completely hours ago. The condition known as acute tubular necrosis meant that toxins were flooding the bloodstream. Urea, creatinine, and metabolic acids were building up, crossing the blood-brain barrier. This chemical soup was inducing a state of uremic encephalopathy. For Charles, this meant the pain was finally receding, replaced by a dark, heavy fog. The thirst, that burning, screaming thirst that had tortured him for 20 hours, was dulling. The sensation of his own body, the humiliation of the soiled sheets, the shame of his helplessness, was drifting away. He was floating, but even in this comatose state, the biological machine fought on. This is the cruelty of the human constitution, especially in a man like Charles, who had lived a life of physical vigor, hunting daily until the very end. His body refused to simply switch off. His breathing changed again. It shifted from the jagged Cheney-Stokes pattern to something deeper and more ominous, Kussmaul respiration. This is the body's last-ditch attempt to correct the acidity of the blood. The king began to take deep, labored, gasping breaths, his chest heaving with a terrifying mechanical rhythm. Heave, exhale, heave, exhale. It sounded like a saw cutting through wet wood. To Marie-Thérèse, kneeling by the bed, her rosary beads clicking softly in the silence, it sounded like the king was fighting an invisible wrestler. She watched the rise and fall of the chest, terrified that each heave would be the last, and equally terrified that it wouldn't be, that this suffering would stretch on until dawn. "It is too hard," she whispered to the Duke. "He is fighting too hard." The Duke of Angoulême, the king's son, looked at his father. He was a quiet, unassuming man, often overshadowed by Charles's charisma. Now he saw the father he worshipped reduced to a biological specimen. He saw the sunken temples, the pinched nose, the blue lips pulled back from the teeth in a rictus that looked like a snarl. "It is the Bourbon blood," the Duke murmured, his voice cracking. "It does not know how to yield." Around 1 a.m., a subtle change occurred. The deep heaving breaths began to shallow. The acidosis had won. The respiratory center in the brainstem, poisoned and oxygen-starved, was failing. The breaths became irregular, soft gasps spaced apart by long, terrifying silences. The room seemed to hold its breath during these pauses. The candle flames stood still. The shadows stopped dancing. Dr. Bougon stepped closer. He signaled to the priest. The Bishop of Hermopolis, who had been dozing in a chair in the corner, started awake and hurried to the bedside. He began to recite the prayers for the dying, his voice a low drone against the silence. "Proficisere, anima Christiana, de hoc mundo." Charles X, the man who had been the Comte d'Artois, the exquisite youth of Versailles, the lover of beautiful women, the hunter of stags, the King of France, opened his eyes one last time. It was likely a reflex, a final spasm of the oculomotor nerves, but to those watching it felt profound. The eyes were glazed, dry and sightless, staring past the weeping family, past the ceiling, past the boundaries of the room. They were the color of slate. He did not speak. He did not smile. There were no famous last words, no pronouncements of forgiveness or regret. Cholera does not allow for soliloquies. It takes the voice first. His jaw slackened. The chest rose, a small hitched movement, and then fell. They waited. 1 second, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Marie-Thérèse leaned forward, her hand tightening on the bedpost. Father? There was no next breath. The machine had stopped. The pump had ceased. Dr. Bourbon waited another full minute, his watch ticking loudly in his pocket. He placed a mirror before the king's blue lips. The glass remained clear. No mist of life clouded it. He placed his hand on the chest. The frantic, worm-like fluttering was gone. There was only stillness. Bourbon straightened up. He looked at the Duke of Angoulême and bowed his head. "The king is dead," he said softly. It was approximately 1:30 a.m. on Sunday, November 6th, 1836. The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment, no one moved. The violence of the last 30 hours, the vomiting, the cramps, the chaos, made the sudden stillness feel unnatural, almost deafening. The storm had passed, leaving behind a shipwreck. But then, the reality of the disease intruded on the solemnity of death. In most royal deaths, the moments following the passing are filled with ritual. The body is washed, dressed in ceremonial robes, and laid out in state. The subjects are invited to view the monarch. But this was a cholera death, and a cholera corpse is a dangerous thing. Even as the family wept, Dr. Bourbon was calculating the risks. He knew, even with the limited knowledge of the time, that the body was a vessel of contagion. The fluids that had killed the king were still infectious. The miasma was potent. "Your Highnesses," Bourbon said gently but firmly to the family, "we must leave the room. The air, it is not safe." He was right. The room was a biological hazard zone, but Marie-Thérèse refused to leave immediately. She insisted on closing the king's eyes. She reached out with her hand, a hand that had known so much loss, and pressed down on the eyelids. But here, the final horror of dehydration revealed itself. The eyelids, dried and shrunken, refused to stay closed. They slid back, revealing the milky, yellowing sclera beneath. The king stared back at her, his expression frozen in a permanent, wide-eyed gaze of shock. It was a small, gruesome detail, but it broke her. She turned away, burying her face in her hands, and allowed the Duke to lead her out of the room. Now the servants and the doctor were left alone with the body. The transformation of the corpse in the hours after death was rapid and disturbing. Usually, rigor mortis takes several hours to set in. In cholera cases, due to the extreme depletion of ATP in the muscles during the violent cramps, rigor mortis is almost instantaneous. Within minutes, Charles X stiffened, his limbs locked into the positions they had held at the moment of death, legs slightly drawn up, hands clawed. The muscles, already contracted by the disease, froze hard as rock, and the color deepened. As the blood settled, dependent lividity set in, but combined with the cyanosis, it turned the king's back and legs a deep, bruising black blue. He looked less like a man who had died of natural causes, and more like a man who had been beaten to death. Dr. Bourbon and the valets had to work quickly. They performed a hasty, modified embalming, a battlefield triage operation. Tradition dictated the removal of the heart, the last piece of the Bourbon mystic to be salvaged, which was placed in a silver urn. But for the rest of the body, they had to strip the soiled linens heavy with infectious rice water. These were bundled up and immediately taken out to be burned. They washed the body with vinegar and chloride of lime. It was a grim, mechanical task. As they turned the body to wash the back, the stark thinness of the king was revealed. He had lost perhaps 15 or 20 pounds of water weight in a single day. His ribs stood out like the hull of a starving ship. They dressed him not in the royal robes, but in the uniform of a cavalry general, a final attempt to restore some martial dignity to the old soldier. They pinned his orders and medals to the chest. Even in death, his skin retained that haunting slate-gray pigmentation. He looked like a statue cast in lead. By 4 a.m., the task was done. The windows were thrown open to let the cold night air of Gorizia rush in, chasing out the smell of sickness. But the fear remained. Downstairs in the palazzo, the servants were boiling everything: water, clothes, dishes. They scrubbed the floors with vinegar until their hands were raw. They knew that the Blue Death did not die with the host. It lingered. It waited on doorknobs, on bedsheets, in the water pitcher. The news began to leak out of the palazzo before dawn. A messenger was dispatched to the Austrian authorities. Charles X is dead. The reaction in the town of Gorizia was a mixture of pity and terror. They felt for the old exile, yes, but mostly they were terrified that his death signaled a full-blown epidemic in their midst. The King of France had brought the plague to their doorstep. In Paris, the news would travel slower, via semaphore telegraph and courier. When it would arrive days later, it would be met with a strange ambivalence. The man who had defined the Restoration, who had been the bogeyman of the liberals and the idol of the ultras, was gone. But in the quiet room in Gorizia, as the first gray light of Sunday dawn crept across the floorboards, the significance was more elemental. The body on the bed was no longer a political symbol. It was proof of human fragility. The king who had believed his touch could cure scrofula, who had believed his authority was written in the stars, had been dismantled by a microscopic bacterium. He lay there, a blue king in a general's uniform, his eyes still half open behind the coins they had placed on them, staring into a future where kings would become increasingly irrelevant, and where the microscopic world would continue to rule over all of us. The sun rose higher. The church bells of Gorizia began to ring for Sunday Mass. They rang for the bakers, the shoemakers, the farmers, and they rang for the dead man in the Palazzo Coronini, who was now just another name on the long list of the cholera dead. The story was ending, but the final act, the burial of a king who belonged nowhere, was yet to come. By the afternoon of November 7th, less than 36 hours after his death, the king was placed in his coffin. It was not a single wooden box, but a containment system designed to seal the miasma inside. First, a coffin of lead, soldered shut to be airtight, then a coffin of walnut, finally an outer casing of oak. The king was hermetically sealed, trapped in a heavy triple-layered prison to protect the living from the dead. The news had rippled through Gorizia, and the town was gripped by a somber tension. The locals respected the old man, but they feared his corpse. The authorities wanted him underground as quickly as possible. There would be no transport back to France. The government of Louis Philippe in Paris had no desire to receive the body of the deposed monarch, and certainly not a body riddled with cholera. Charles X would have to be buried where he fell, in exile. On November 11th, 1836, the funeral procession began. It was a gray, weeping day, the sky hanging low over the Julian Alps, the rain turning the roads to mud. The tragedy of Charles X is defined by the contrast between this muddy funeral and his coronation at Reims, 11 years earlier. At Reims, the cathedral had blazed with light, the air thick with the sound of trumpets and the roar of Vive le Roi from 10,000 throats. The entire nobility of France had been there. At Gorizia, the procession was small, dark, and silent. A few carriages draped in black, the Duke of Angoulême, looking aged and broken, the Duchess of Berry, a handful of loyal courtiers who had followed him to the bitter end, and a detachment of Austrian soldiers, present more to maintain order than to honor the dead. They wound their way up the steep hill toward the Franciscan monastery of Castagna Visa, which overlooks the town. The horses struggled in the mud. The rain drummed on the roof of the hearse. There were no crowds lining the streets, only a few curious locals watching from behind shuttered windows, crossing themselves as the plague carriage passed. When they reached the monastery, the monks were waiting. They were simple men, Franciscans pledged to poverty, a stark contrast to the opulent bishops of the French court. They received the body of the king, not as a monarch, but as a sinner in need of rest. The coffin was too heavy to be lowered easily into the crypt. It required ropes and straining muscles to maneuver the lead-lined box into the small vault beneath the church floor. The chanting of the monks, Dies Irae, Dies Illa, echoed off the cold stone walls. As the stone slab was slid into place, sealing Charles X into the dark, it marked the definitive end of the Bourbon absolute monarchy. He was not buried in the royal necropolis of Saint-Denis, alongside Dagobert, Henry IV, and Louis XIV. He was buried in a borrowed grave in a foreign land, a guest even in death. The reaction in France when the news finally arrived was a testament to how completely the world had moved on. The newspapers reported the death with a respectful but distant tone. There was no national outpouring of grief. The Paris stock market did not crash. The cafes remained open. The playwrights and poets Victor Hugo, Balzac, Chateaubriand wrote their reflections, but they were eulogies for an era, not just a man. Chateaubriand, the great writer who had remained loyal to Charles despite his political disagreements, wrote a moving epitaph, but even he recognized the grim irony of the end. The king, who had wanted to be the father of the nation, had died an orphan of history. But the true legacy of this story lies not in politics, but in the Blue Death itself. The death of Charles X was a high-profile victory for Vibrio cholerae. It proved that the disease was the great leveler of the 19th century. It shattered the illusion of aristocratic immunity. If the most Christian king, the anointed of God, could be turned into a shivering, vomiting blue husk in 24 hours, then no one was safe. This fear, the fear that killed Charles X, drove the next great revolution in Europe. It wasn't a political revolution, it was a sanitary one. The terror of the Blue Death forced governments to build sewers, to clean water supplies, to pave streets, and to understand that the health of the nation depended on the health of its poorest citizens. The cholera pandemics gave birth to modern public health. In a strange, twisted way, the death of the old monarchy helped pave the way for the modern scientific state. The goddess of hygiene replaced the goddess of reason. Today, on the border of Italy and Slovenia, in the town of Nova Gorica, stands the Kostanjevica Monastery. It is a quiet, peaceful place, smelling of cypress and roses. In the crypt, there are several marble sarcophagi. One of them bears a Latin inscription, Hic Jacet Carolus Decimus, Francorum Rex. He is still there. While almost every other French monarch rests in the Cathedral of Saint-Denis in Paris, Charles remains in exile. There have been periodic discussions about repatriating his remains to France, but they have never come to fruition. Perhaps it is fitting. He remains a prisoner of the geography of his fall. But more than that, he remains a monument to the fragility of human power. The story of Charles X is no longer about the robes of state or the crown of Charlemagne. It is about the Blue Death. It reveals the terrifying biological reality that underpins all life. A man who thought he was a god, stripped down to his trembling mortal core. His story is a reminder that nature does not care about our titles. It does not read our history books. It does not bow to our flags. Charles X wanted to be remembered as the king who restored the glory of the past, Instead, he is remembered as the Blue King, the monarch who was conquered not by an army, but by a single drop of water.